How's it going, guys? Brock here. Today's video is going to be about Carl Jung's book, The Undiscovered Self. Like the video before about The Heroes of Thousand Faces by Joseph Campbell, this video is going to be greatly hinged upon the subject of psychoanalysis. So if that's something that you're interested in, that you might be interested in, if you just like the previous video I made before, then this is a really good place to start because Carl Jung's typically thought of as the main person behind psychoanalysis, along with Sigmund Freud and even Joseph Campbell. So before I actually go into the chapters and the content of the chapters, I just want to give the context of Carl Jung and the context in which he speaks. So when Carl Jung wrote this book, it was roughly around the time of the dropping of the nuclear bombs. It was during the rise of the Soviet Union and the rise of the tension between the Soviet Union and the United States, the Red Scare, communism versus democracy. So a lot of the things that he speaks about in this book is based on the situation around him, being World War II, being communism, the Iron Curtain, etc. So the first chapter is called The Plight of the Individual in Modern Society. Now this is probably the second most important chapter of the essay because it introduces many of the ideas that Jung believes and argues throughout the essay. Some of these ideas being that mass movements such as protests, dictatorships, any institution, even religion, isn't or aren't necessarily a good thing. Why? So Jung says that mass movements often ignore and deny the role and place of the individual and reduce the individual to an anonymous element of society. In such a society, the individual does not exist as an entity. Instead, individuals are one and of the same. Jung warns that if the individual is unacknowledged and diminished by society, he is vulnerable to influence of institutions of power to manipulate him into serving their one-sided aims and policies. So basically he's saying that if the individual is not acknowledged as a person, as a single entity, then people are vulnerable and are more willing to give up their own selves, their individuality to institutions. And institutions, therefore, will have more power over individuals and in turn have a much easier time serving their one-sided aims or political agendas. He then begs a question: are we able to resist mass movements in society? His answer is yes. He advocates that the unconscious nature of our psyche must be acknowledged so that we can resist the influence of unthinking masses. We have to, as an individual, look inside ourselves and understand our inner being, our inner psyche, in order to, counteract the influence of these institutions. The undiscovered self, as he puts it, is an aspect of human existence that should be accessed so that we can gain self-knowledge and resist fanaticism. To be able to do this, though, we must face the duality of the human psyche and acknowledge the factions of both good and evil in us, and hold the opposites in balance. So this is going to be a really big part of the book, is the idea that we humans by nature are both good and evil. And the only way that we can live pure and true to ourselves is by holding both factions of good and evil in balance. And when we do this, we're able to resist the external powers and the opposites that manifest in society. So also in this chapter, Jung highlights the importance of irregularities. Now, what do I mean by irregularities? What I mean is that Jung dismisses the idea that individuals can be accurately represented by statistics, that generalizations, despite their empirical groundings, accurately describe what an individual is about. He warns that although science performs a function of creating some order, he says the statistical method shows the facts in the light of the ideal average, but does not give us a picture of the empirical reality. Theories tend to rob the individual of his value, whereas it should be the individual who should be the true focus of scientific investigation. All right, moving into the second chapter, which is called Religion as the Counterbalance to Mass-Mindedness. So in this chapter, Jung actually states that religion can be used as a way to counteract, the mass movements, the mass-mindedness that the state can kind of impose on people. However, in this chapter, he also discussed, the common qualities between the state and the church. He says, the state has taken the place of God, and that is why, seen from this angle, the socialist dictatorships are religions and state slavery is a form of worship. So in the way that, an external power is used to kind of manipulate the masses, the religion, the church, does the same thing. It uses the element of fear to scare people into becoming obedient to, the church's dogma. The second part of the essay is called Religion as the Counterbalance to Mass-Mindedness. And in this essay, Jung compares the two institutions of church and of the state and discusses their differences and similarities. He says, the state has taken the place of God. That is why, seen from this angle, the socialist dictatorships are religions and state slavery is a form of worship. In this way, external power is used to influence the masses as well as the dynamics of groups, using the elements of fear to scare people into becoming obedient to their ideologies. For example, socialist dictatorships are worshipped in the same way God is worshipped in a form of religion. The state not only ignores the right of the individual, but has physically taken away the metaphysical basis with which he orients himself in the world. The individual can no longer influence his political environment based on his individual ethical decisions. Just as the addition of however many zeros will never make a unit, so the value of community depends on the spiritual and moral stature of the individuals composing it. So the third chapter is about the position of the West in the question of religion. This chapter starts off with Jung claiming that the only threat to mass thinking is the idea of self-discovery. He says, one possibility remains, and that is the breakdown of power from within, which must be left to follow its own inner development. This is where the individual can play a vital role. When he realizes that self-knowledge is the key to political power and is the way you can break this mass-mindedness and this mass control of the state or of religion. Now, taking it a step back and relating it to modern-day U.S. intervention, I would argue that Jung would say that the U.S. intervening in, countries like Iraq, countries like Afghanistan, trying to establish a democracy, trying to establish our own political views is, futile. And that's because I believe Jung would say that these people, they have to come to terms with their own inner self before, as a state, as a country, they can change. It must be left, quote, to follow its own development, inner development. So jumping back in, Jung then transitions into the question of religion, where he asserts that religious fanaticism holds a great danger. When men replace their own inner spirituality and experience with God, they're at risk of losing their identity as well as their sense of self, which resides within the psyche. He states the only way to fix this, the antidote, should in this case be an equally potent faith of a different, non-materialistic kind, and that the religious attitude grounded upon it would be the only effective defense against the danger of psychic infection. Jung claims that the church and state are the two largest institutions and both have the same aim, to control the masses. Jung highlights the danger of dogma, of a creed, because as the creed manifests itself as a public entity, as a public institution, it lends itself a servant to the state, but masquerades itself as the important man-to-God relationship. However, it's important to realize that a true relationship, a true healthy religious experience isn't one founded on control, isn't founded on this masquerade made by the church. The true relationship comes and is derived from a self-reflection, self-inner relationship of God, not an external one, as a church would have you believe. So chapter 4 is called The Individual's Understanding of Himself, and this is probably the most important chapter because it carries the most weight throughout the essay. So in this chapter, Jung states that individuals can be externally intelligent, meaning they can be intelligent in the sense that they're really good at chemistry, really good at math, really good at history. These are things we typically attribute to being an intelligent individual. Jung states, however, that despite this, we still don't know our own minds. We are not intelligent when it comes to our inner self. He says, and I quote, "The paradoxical valuation of humanity by man himself is in truth a matter for wonder, and one can only explain it as springing from an extraordinary uncertainty of judgment." In other words, man is an enigma to himself. This is understandable, seeing that he lacks the means of comparison necessary for self-knowledge. He knows how to distinguish himself from other animals, but as a conscious, reflecting being gifted with speech, he lacks all criteria for self-judgment. This is until he discovers himself. Jung believes that our psyche has never been understood, but also says that consciousness is a precondition for being, that the psyche harbors the consciousness. In regards to science, religion, and state, Jung says, quote, "Firstly, the individual psyche, just because of its individuality, is an exception to the statistical rule. Secondly, the churches grant it validity only insofar as it acknowledges their dogma. In other words, when it surrenders to a collective category." So, the aim is to focus on the individual, not humanity. In general, people are scared to acknowledge their own psyche because of their fear of the unconscious. Despite this, and despite the fact that the psyche remains an insolvable puzzle, people should not give up their search for themselves. Jung connects everything that we've talked about thus far to medicine, and he explains how doctors often use statistics to find solutions. They base their studies on similarities and generalizations to arrive at conclusions. Yet this idea of generalizations, of similarities, cannot be applied to our unconscious. There are more exceptions than generalizations, and reality exists from irregularities. The church also falls into this trap of generalizations. The church focuses on mass action, and this stands in stark contrast to Christ's invitation to come to his table as an individual. Jung says, "And are not Jesus and Paul prototypes of those who, trusting their inner experience, have gone their own individual ways, disregarding public opinion?" And this is the point he's trying to make, that generalizations do not describe humans, but rather that irregularities describe humans. Humans stand out from generalizations. Individuals are different from, the statistics that surround us. That's what makes an individual an individual. So the 5th chapter is called The Philosophical and the Psychological Approach to Life. And in this chapter, Jung advocates that reality exists in the individual psyche in the form of consciousness. Our ideas are formulated in the mind and are influenced by the outside world. However, in the outside world, if something remains stable, there's not really a need to change it. It doesn't contain the ability for consciousness. Religion is an example of such an experience. Jung explains, "We experience and reflect the collective situation, which is split And in the same way, we have become suspicious of the original word pertaining to the Christian faith, to the myths that support the word. Jung states that one's relationship and experience to God is metaphysical, meaning it transcends physical matter and the laws of nature, which means it presents only in the mind of the individual. Because this relationship is not empirically observed or experienced, it is said to derive from the unconscious. Jung argues that this is the only true religious experience that man can hope to arrive at. He says, modern man can know himself only insofar as he can become conscious of himself. His consciousness therefore orients itself chiefly by observing and investigating the world around him. The danger exists that this activity is so exacting that we lose touch with our instinctive and intuitive ability to orient ourselves in the outer world. As we disconnect from this ability, a dissonance arises within us, and in turn we assert more power to the external world. We give more of ourselves to the external world. We seek the wrongs in the external world, but replace them with other wrongs. To combat this, Jung believes the answer is for us to become conscious of our inner selves, our inner world, to access a second psychic authority that we integrate to prevent a similar split between our inner and outer world. So the next chapter is called Self-Knowledge, and in this chapter, Jung emphasizes the fact that the individual must access the power of his unconscious. True power resides in self-knowledge, which includes the knowledge of the unconscious. This knowledge is essential to arrive at a meaningful religious experience. Jung doesn't say that the unconscious is actually equal to God or on the same level, but he does say that the problem of God is a transcendental one. Jung warns against the idea of the betrayal of the intellectuals. So he says that it's a pretty sad state of affairs when the presence of high intelligence excludes the ability to access the deeper values of human existence. For example, of that of the heart. So what he means by this is we often look upon things like emotion, irrationality, love, following your dreams with disdain. We don't often support them because they're not backed by science. They're not quote-unquote intelligent. But Jung says that this is really sad and that we should actually access this part of human existence. Jung goes on further to say that when man has not yet accessed his unconscious, he will deny that evil is a part of every individual. So what he means by this is that when man is not in touch with his own inner psyche, he fails to recognize the evil within himself. Jung believes that every human is inherently evil. Now, while that might sound cynical or bad, it's not necessarily a bad thing, because Jung believes that every good person balances the evil within them. There's a balance between the evil in a person and the good within a person, and that's how you remain in touch with your inner psyche. He says that if as an individual you deny your own evil, you deny that evil is part of every individual, you don't have the good or evil in balance within yourself, then a popular lie will prevail that evil resides in the enemy outside the individual. And what I mean by this is you start to isolate yourselves from everyone else. You start to say, oh, I'm good, but anyone such as an enemy is bad. They're really the evil ones. They have evil within them, but I don't. But in doing so, the individual projects his shadow outside of himself. Jung says, none of us stands outside humanity's black collective shadow, for only a fool can permanently neglect the condition of his own nature. In fact, the negligence is the best means of making an instrument of evil. By neglecting to understand your own evil, your own inner psyche, you are facilitating an instrument of evil. Jung also makes a really good point and an almost touching point. He says a human relationship is not based on differentiation and perfection, for these only emphasize the differences and call forth the exact opposite. It is based, rather, on imperfection, on what is weak, helpless, in need of support. The very ground and motive of dependence. The perfect has no need of each other, but weakness has, for it seeks support. It does not confront its partner with anything that might force him into an inferior position and even humiliate him. This quote highlights the importance of imperfection when it comes to building a solid relationship with another human being. A healthy human relationship isn't based on, perfection, but quite the opposite. It's built on imperfections and flaws. And I think that's a very powerful message that Jung is spreading. So finally, the last chapter is just a summary, a conclusion, a wrap-up of everything that he's been trying to relay to you. He says that with self-knowledge comes the ability to choose what is best for the individual. If people aren't in touch with their own inner psyche, if they aren't in touch with their own inner world, they will be led astray more easily by mass movements that disregard their true interests and alienate them from themselves. Jung emphasizes that individuals who live from a position of self-knowledge should inspire others towards living in harmony with their inner and outer worlds. He says that the world will be saved by individuals who have a strong sense of their inner world and a commitment to live from a place where they are holding the opposites. In balance. That is what this is all about, is balance. So that's the end of the book. Before the video ends, I'm actually going to touch upon what I thought about the book and my own thoughts. So what I really liked about this book was the idea that Jung emphasizes the idea that the answers we seek in life, such as, what is the meaning of life? I'm having a problem with so-and-so. How can I fix it? What is better for me, this or that? Anything really. Any question that we have the answer to it can usually be found by looking inwards. And he highlights the idea that you're not necessarily going to find the answer in the external world. That more than likely, if you're in tune with yourself, if you're in touch with your inner psyche, you will find the answer. I like how he emphasizes the idea that human nature exists, human reality exists out of irregularities, and that humans can't accurately be described by statistics. Maybe this is me talking from an egotistical point of view, but the idea that humans can be summed up by, a statistic, by a single sentence, just doesn't seem right to me, because there's more to each individual than just numbers. So I really like that about it. I also like the idea of keeping evil and good in balance, that he speaks about this balance between evil and good. As a person, I'm not necessarily sure if I believe in the good or evil, or if humans are inherently good or evil. That's something I have to think about. But overall, that's a really interesting concept. And I really, really like the idea that he kind of emphasizes that the power to do anything is within the individual. If you want to change your life, it's up to you to change your life. No one else can do it. The external world can't help you. Only you have the power to do it. Relating this to Joseph Campbell, who says, follow your bliss. It's pretty interesting, because if you do what you love in life, if you stay true to yourself, if you're in touch with your inner psyche, then your life will be good. Your life will be pure. I mean, I'm not going to lie to you and say that, you're not going to go through life with some ups and downs. You are. But if you stay in tune with your inner psyche, with yourself, you will live a fulfilling and happy life. And I think that's what Jung is really trying to portray. There is obviously some nuance in what I'm saying and what he's saying, but I think the general idea is the same. Now, if you like this book, just ask me. I have a few books I can recommend, some authors, Sigmund Freud being one of them. One of my favorite authors is Joseph Campbell. I did a video on him. But overall, psychoanalysis is really interesting, and I think that if everyone just, dipped a little toe into it, it would be better. Our world would be better, because the more you know about yourself, the more you know about the world around you. So I'm going to end the video right there. Thanks for watching. I'll come up with a few more videos later in the future.